The house was quiet in a way that made the two children feel smaller than ever before. They had been used to noise and laughter and the smell of cooking and the sound of footsteps coming and going, but now there was nothing, just empty rooms and shadows that seemed to stretch longer than before. The children sat close together, on the worn carpet, holding on to each other because there was nothing else to hold on to. Their small hands clasped tightly and their eyes searched for something familiar. But all they found was emptiness. Earlier that day, people had come and gone. People who promised to love them and protect them, but who now seemed to have forgotten they existed. One by one, the relatives who had said they would take care of them found reasons not to stay. The children could not understand why the world had turned its back on them, why the people who smiled at them yesterday were walking away today, their small hearts filled with fear and confusion and something like a quiet sadness that they did not have the words to name. They had been told many times that life is not fair, but they had never really understood what that meant until this moment. They thought maybe someone would stay, someone who would make everything okay again. But the adults kept leaving, and the children learned that promises can be broken without warning. The house that had once felt warm and safe now felt cold and unwelcoming, and every creak of the floorboards reminded them of all the people who had left. In the middle of all this, a woman quietly entered the house. She was not rich. She had no fancy clothes or big car. She had little money and lived in a small place that was barely enough for her own life. But there was something in her eyes that shone brighter than wealth or power. It was a light that said she could not turn away from the children no matter what. She knelt down to them and offered her hand, and for the first time that day, the children felt a small flicker of hope. The children were hesitant at first. They had learned that people leave. They had learned that adults often cared more about themselves than about them. But this woman stayed. She spoke softly and gently and did not demand anything from them. She did not scold them for crying or for clinging to each other. She simply sat with them and let them be small and scared and confused. She told them that she would not leave them, and she meant it in a way that they could feel deep in their bones. Days passed, and the house slowly began to feel alive again, but not in the way it had before. It was not filled with the laughter of a large family or the bustle of people coming and going. It was filled with the quiet care of someone who had chosen to stay, someone who cooked what little she could for them and tucked them into bed even when she herself was exhausted. She taught them small lessons about life, about kindness, about standing up even when the world seems to turn against you. And in these small lessons, the children began to understand what love could look like. Even when the world seemed cruel, the children began to notice the sacrifices. She woke up early to make sure they had something to eat. She worked long hours for little pay, but she never let them feel the hunger. She never let them feel the cold. She hid her own tiredness so they would not be burdened by it. Every small act of care became a thread that held the children together in a world that seemed determined to tear them apart. At first, the children only trusted her because they had no choice. They had learned too early that no one else would stay. But slowly they began to love her. They began to see that she was different. She did not leave. She did not abandon them. She carried their small hearts gently, and without judgment she listened to their fears and their dreams. She told them stories at night that made the dark feel less scary, and she reminded them that they were not alone. The neighbors whispered about them. They said that a poor woman could not possibly raise 2 children on her own. They said that it was foolish to try. They doubted her strength and her ability to care for them, but the woman did not listen. She did not fight back. She simply kept showing up. She kept feeding them and protecting them and staying awake at night. When the children needed comfort, she became a quiet force in a world that seemed determined to ignore the children. Children began to notice small miracles in their lives. Even when there was little food on the table, there was always enough to keep them alive. Even when the days were long and hard, they found moments of laughter and small joys in each other, and in her presence they learned that love was not about riches or gifts. It was about presence, about patience, about staying even when it was hard, about choosing to care even when the world said it was impossible. The first winter was the hardest. The cold seeped into the walls and the floors, and the children shivered as they huddled together at night. The woman wrapped them in blankets and held them close. She sang quietly to them so that the fear would not feel so heavy. She told them that storms pass and that spring always comes even. After the darkest winter, and in her voice, they found a rhythm of hope that had been missing since the people had walked. Why school was difficult. They were small and shy and had learned that the world often seemed cruel. They were teased by other children who had families who were complete and perfect, and who could not understand why these two were different. But the woman taught them resilience. She told them that being small and poor did not mean being weak. She told them that their hearts were stronger than anyone could imagine if they chose to protect them. She reminded them that their value was not measured by wealth or status, but by the love and kindness they carried to Vennings, were filled with small lessons she taught them to read not just words, but people. She taught them to notice small acts of kindness in the world. She showed them how to give without expecting anything in return. She showed them that courage was not always loud. It could be quiet and patient and persistent. She showed them that even in the face of abandonment, there was always a choice to care and to love. The months turned into years. The children grew stronger. They grew in ways that were invisible to the world, but essential to their survival. They learned that pain could be met with patience. They learned that fear could be softened with love. They learned that even when everyone else walked away, there was always a place to belong if someone chose to stay, and in the heart of a poor woman. They found that place there were moments of doubt and tears and frustration. But every time the children wanted to give up, they saw her standing quietly in the corner watching over them. She never scolded or demanded. She simply showed them that giving up was not the only option. She carried their lives gently and patiently, and with a love that refused to turn away on. So the first chapter of their new life was written not in grand gestures, not in wealth or fame, but in the quiet moments of care and courage that built the foundation for a life that had seemed impossible when everyone had walked away. She stayed. And in staying, she gave the children something no one else could. She gave them hope. And even in the darkest nights when they could barely see past the fear, they could feel it, the presence of someone who chose them, who refused to leave them, who carried their hearts as if they were her own, and in that presence they began to understand the first miracle of all love. Chooses even when the world does not. Life with the woman who had chosen to stay was far from easy. The children quickly learned that love alone could not fill empty stomachs or keep the cold from seeping into the small rooms they lived in. Every morning she would wake before the sun and quietly start her day preparing what little she could to feed them. The kitchen was small and worn. She did not have many ingredients, but she found ways to make the food stretch. She always made sure the children had something warm to eat, even if it meant she went hungry herself. Children watched her and slowly began to understand what it meant to care for someone else. They had learned before that the world often ignored their needs, but this woman never did. She carried their lives as if they were precious jewels. She washed their clothes carefully, mending the small tears and holes. She helped them with their schoolwork even when she had no energy left from working all day. She never complained. She never demanded praise. She simply did what she could to make their lives better. Children began to notice the small ways she sacrificed for them. She would wake up in the middle of the night if they were sick, even when her body ached, and she had to work early in the morning. She would walk long distances just to get a loaf of bread or some fresh vegetables. She would spend her small wages on shoes or clothes for them instead of herself. They began to see that love was not always about gifts or grand gestures, but about showing up consistently and caring when no one else was. Watching school was not easy. The children often felt tired from waking early and helping around the small house. They were smaller and weaker than other children, and sometimes the teachers did not understand their struggles. They were teased by classmates who had more than they did, who had families that were present and wealthy, who could not understand the world they lived in. But the woman taught them to keep going. She told them that education was important, even if it was hard. She reminded them that learning could give them the chance to change their lives one day. Despite the hardships, the children began to thrive in small ways. They learned how to read more quickly than others. They learned how to pay attention to small details. They learned how to help each other without needing to be told. They began to notice the world around them in ways that other children did not, because they had been forced to rely on observation and care. They began to feel a sense of pride in small achievements, even when the world did not notice. Evenings were quiet, but Filled with lessons, the woman would sit with the children and teach them about life. She would tell them stories from her past, stories of people struggled but never gave up. She would tell them that courage was not always loud, but often quiet. In persistence, she would remind them that even when the world seemed cruel, there were ways to protect each other and ways to find hope. She taught them to be patient with themselves and with others, and to always look for the good, even in hard times. The children slowly learned to appreciate the small joys of life. They found happiness in the warmth of a blanket in winter, in the taste of fresh bread in the morning, and the sound of birds outside their window. They learned to find laughter, even in difficult moments, and they began to realize that the woman had given them more than food and shelter. She had given them the tools to survive and the courage to face the world. As the years went by, the children grew stronger. They grew in ways that were not always visible to others but were essential to their survival. They learned responsibility at a young age. They learned to care for each other. They learned that patience and persistence could change difficult situations. They began to understand that their value was not measured by what they had, but by what they carried in their hearts. They began to see that the woman had given them a foundation that would last a lifetime. The woman herself continued to struggle. She worked long hours for little money. She often went without sleep or food to make sure the children were cared for. She faced the judgment of neighbors, who whispered that a poor woman could not possibly raise children alone. She faced exhaustion and loneliness, but she did not give up. She continued to carry their lives with a steady hand and a quiet heart. The children began to notice her sacrifices in ways that touched them deeply. They realized that she had given up many of her own dreams and comforts for their sake. They began to feel a deep sense of gratitude and love for her. They began to understand that their lives were shaped not just by survival, but by the choices she made every day to stay with them and protect them. Friendships outside the home were difficult. The children did not have many toys or clothes like other children. They did not always have money for school trips or celebrations, but the woman taught them to find joy in what they did have. She taught them that true friendship came from loyalty and kindness, not material possessions. She taught them to give without expecting anything in return. She taught them that love could be shown in the smallest acts, and that small acts could create big changes. Children began to dream in quiet ways. They dreamed of a future where they could make a difference. They dreamed of a life where they could help others as the woman had helped them. They dreamed of a world where they could give back even a fraction of the love they had received. They carried these dreams in their hearts, and they began to work towards them even when the world seemed to offer little encouragement. I've been in the hardest times. They found strength in each other and in the woman. The days were long and tiring and often filled with challenges, but they had a sense of purpose that came from being cared for and from caring in return. They learned that struggle could build character and that perseverance could create opportunities. Even when life seemed unfair, they began to understand that love and sacrifice were powerful forces that could shape the future. The woman never demanded recognition for what she did. She never sought praise or gratitude. She simply continued to care. She continued to provide food and shelter and guidance. She continued to teach patience and kindness. She continued to show up every day, no matter the difficulties. She became the quiet anchor that held the children steady in a world that had often let them down. The children slowly began to see the world differently. They began to notice kindness in strangers. They began to understand the value of helping others. They began to feel empathy for those who struggled. They began to see that life was not only about what they received, but about what they could give. They learned to measure success, not in material things, but in love and resilience and courage. Small victories became big milestones. They learned to read well, and quickly they began to do well in school. Despite the odds, they learned to manage small amounts of money. They learned to cook simple meals. They learned to care for each other in ways that felt natural and powerful. They began to see that the lessons of the woman who stayed with them were creating a life they could be proud of. The world outside continued to be challenging. The children were still poor. They were still small in a large and often indifferent world, but inside the house they had love. They had guidance. They had stability. They had the knowledge that someone had chosen them and refused to leave. This became the source of their strength and hope through Small moments of laughter and quiet learning through evenings spent together and mornings of care, the children grew into beings who understood the power of love and sacrifice. They began to carry forward what the woman had given them. They began to see that the choices of one person who refused to walk away could change everything. They began to understand that miracles often started quietly and without notice in small acts of care and courage, and so the children continued to grow. They learned patience and resilience. They learned kindness and courage. They learned that life could be hard, but that love could make even the hardest days bearable. They learned that they could survive and even thrive. Because someone had chosen to stay and fight for them, they began to understand that their lives were being shaped in ways they could not yet fully see, but that would carry them far into the future. Every meal the woman cooked, every night she stayed awake, every small lesson she taught became a part of them. Every moment of care and attention created a foundation that could not be shaken. They began to see that the struggles of the present were creating strength for the future. They began to understand that love could be a force stronger than fear or hardship. They began to see that the woman who had chosen to stay was not just their guardian, but the architect of their future. The children began to dream bigger. They began to imagine possibilities that had seemed impossible. They began to see themselves as capable of creating change. They began to understand that the life they were living was not just about surviving, but about learning how to thrive. They began to see that the love and sacrifices of the woman who stayed with them had given them a gift that could never be measured in money or fame, but only in the strength of their hearts and the courage of their spirits. Children had grown a little older now, and the world outside their small house was becoming more complicated. They faced challenges that tested them in ways they had never imagined. Schoolwork became harder and expectations grew. Teachers often did not notice the small victories they achieved or the hard work they put in. Some days they felt invisible and unimportant. Their clothes were still old and patched, and other children sometimes laughed or whispered when they walked by, but the woman who had chosen to stay never let them feel weak. She reminded them that struggles were part of life and that every difficulty they faced could make them stronger. She encouraged them to try even when it seemed impossible. She taught them to find solutions even when it felt like the world was against them. She showed them that patience and persistence could change outcomes, and that failure was only a step on the path to success. The children began to take on more responsibilities around the house. They learned to cook simple meals, learned to clean and care for their small home. They learned to look after each other, the woman who had given them so much. Their small hands and bodies were becoming tools of care. They were learning that life was not only about receiving, but also about giving and supporting those you love. The woman often reminded them of their potential. She would say that the world was full of opportunities for those who were willing to work hard and believe in themselves. She told them that intelligence and kindness were treasures no one could take away. She taught them that respect and honesty were worth more than wealth, and that small, consistent efforts could lead to big results over time. Even when life felt hard, the children found comfort in small routines. They began to enjoy mornings where the sun peeked through the windows. They found happiness in helping the woman prepare food or in tidying up the small house. They laughed quietly in the evenings and shared stories of their day. They began to see that even small joys could make life feel fuller and more meaningful. They were learning to notice beauty in simple things and to hold on to hope. Friendships outside the home remained difficult. They often felt different from other children and sometimes faced unkind words or rejection. But the woman taught them that true friends were those who valued the heart and not appearances. She reminded them that being different was not a weakness, and that the kindness and courage they carried made them strong even when others did not understand. The children started to notice the sacrifices the woman made for them in ways that touched their hearts deeply. She worked long hours for very little pay. She often went without rest or food to make sure they were cared for. She faced her own struggles, and yet she never complained or asked for help. She simply stayed and gave them her time, her strength, and her love. Her example taught them that real courage is quiet and persistent, and that true love is shown through consistent care. School became a place of both challenge and growth. They faced tests that seemed impossible and lessons that were difficult to understand, but the woman encouraged them to keep trying. She would stay with them after school to help with homework, She would read with them and explain things patiently. She taught them that learning was not always easy, but that knowledge could open doors they could not yet see. Children slowly began to see changes in themselves. They became more confident. They learned to speak up for themselves and for each other. They learned to work through difficulties without giving up. They began to understand that their past struggles were shaping them into people who could face the world with strength and determination. They began to carry hope inside them like a quiet flame that could not be extinguished. Evenings were filled with quiet talks and small lessons. The woman would talk to them about life, about right and wrong, about how to treat others with kindness and respect. She taught them that integrity was more important than popularity. She taught them to be patient and to look for solutions instead of blaming others. She reminded them that mistakes were part of learning and that growth often comes slowly but surely. The children learned the value of empathy. They began to notice when others were struggling and to offer help when they could. They learned that kindness could change the way people felt about themselves and about the world. They began to see that even small acts of care could have a ripple effect, and that helping others did not make them weaker but stronger. They began to understand the power of love and compassion as tools for life. Woman continued to show them what it meant to live with courage. She faced her own difficulties quietly and never let them burden the children. She showed them how to be resilient even when things were not fair. She demonstrated that life could be challenging and sometimes cruel, but that the choices they made and the care they offered could shape their experiences and the experiences of those around them. The children began to dream quietly about the future. They imagined lives where they could do more than survive. They imagined being able to help others and to create change. They thought about the lessons the woman had taught them about patience, courage, and kindness. They held on to these dreams and began to plan small steps to make them real even when resources were limited. The house itself became a place of quiet growth. The walls that had once seemed empty and cold were now filled with the sounds of learning and care. The children had their routines and responsibilities, and the woman guided them with steady hands and an unwavering heart. They learned to find joy in small accomplishments and to celebrate moments of success, even if they were invisible to the rest of the world. Challenges continued to come. Their clothes still wore thin. Their shoes often had holes. Their school supplies were limited, but the children were learning to find creative ways to overcome obstacles. They discovered patience. They discovered problem solving. They discovered the strength to persevere. They began to understand that their circumstances did not define them, but the choices they made and the values they carried could shape their lives. The woman never let them forget the power of love. She showed them how to care for each other. She showed them how to stand together when the world seemed to push them apart. She demonstrated that loyalty and compassion were more valuable than wealth or status. She taught them to believe in themselves, even when others doubted them, and to find strength in the quiet courage that lives in the heart. As the children grew, they began to teach each other in small ways. They shared lessons they had learned from the woman. They reminded each other to be patient, to be kind, and to keep moving forward, even when life seemed unfair. They began to develop a sense of responsibility, not just for themselves, but for each other and for the woman who had given them so much. They were learning to carry the love and lessons they had received into their own actions. The woman's life continued to be filled with struggles. She often worked long hours and faced exhaustion and financial stress. But she never let these challenges show in a way that would scare or burden the children. She remained a quiet and steady presence. She continued to teach patience, courage, and kindness. She continued to protect the children and guide them through life. She remained their anchor and their safe place. Small victories became part of everyday life. The children learned to read and write with skill. They learned to complete schoolwork with diligence. They learned to manage small challenges on their own. They began to see that the choices they made could create opportunities. They learned that perseverance and hard work could lead to results even when life seemed unfair. Through all of this, the children grew stronger. They developed character and resilience. They developed empathy and understanding. They developed a sense of hope and possibility that was rooted in the love and care they had received from the woman. They began to realize that their struggles were shaping them into people who could face life with courage and kindness, and that the lessons of the past were preparing them for a future they could not Yet quiet moments spent together were just as important as the larger challenges. They shared laughter in the evenings. They comforted each other. During difficult times, they celebrated small victories. They learned to see beauty in simple things. They began to understand that life was made up of many small moments, and that the love and care of one person could transform those moments into something meaningful. Children learned the importance of gratitude. They began to notice the sacrifices the woman made for them. They began to feel deep appreciation for her presence and guidance. They understood that her love had been constant and unwavering. Even when the world had turned away, they began to carry that gratitude in their hearts, and to reflect it in the way they treated each other and the world around them. So their lives continued to unfold in quiet growth and resilience. They faced challenges, they experienced small victories. They learned lessons about life, about love, about patience and courage. And through it all, the woman who had chosen to stay remained the central figure. In their lives, she showed them that even in a world that seemed indifferent, there could be steadfast love and guidance, and that the choices of one person could shape the destiny of others in ways that seemed miraculous. The children were growing into young adults now, and life was beginning to pull them in different directions. The small house that had been their world for so long now felt smaller to them, and yet it remained the place where they had learned everything they knew. The woman who had chosen to stay with them continued to guide them quietly, but now she also had to let them make choices on their own. She knew that their time to leave the nest was coming, and that the lessons she had taught them would be tested in ways she could not control. School had become more demanding, and the children had begun to understand that knowledge could open doors for them. They studied hard and pushed themselves, even when it was tiring. They faced moments of doubt and fear, but they remembered the woman's quiet encouragement. She had taught them to be patient, to work through difficulties, and to always try even when the outcome was uncertain. They carried these lessons with them like a shield against the challenges that came their way. The world outside the home was not always kind. They encountered people who judged them for being poor, who assumed they were weak because they had grown up with so little. They faced obstacles in education and work that other young people did not have to deal with. They were often overlooked and underestimated, but they learned to use these moments as fuel to work harder, to prove themselves not to others, but to themselves. They remembered the sacrifices the woman had made and the love she had given, and they refused to let their hardships define them. Leaving home became a mix of excitement and fear. The children had dreams that could not be fulfilled within the small walls of their house. They had ambitions that required them to step into the unknown. They were nervous about leaving the woman who had cared for them through every struggle, but they also understood that she had prepared them for this moment. She had taught them resilience, courage, and the importance of making their own choices. They stepped into the world carrying her lessons and her love inside them. Even as they left the house, they did not forget the woman who had stayed. They called her often and visited when they could. They shared their small successes and their struggles. They sought her advice and her quiet wisdom. They realized that no matter where they went, she would always be their anchor, the person who had believed in them when no one else did. Her presence in their lives had become a foundation that they carried with them into every new challenge. Life in the outside world was not easy. They faced rejection and disappointment. They struggled to make ends meet, and sometimes wondered if they had made the right choices. They remembered the long nights spent studying, the early mornings when they had helped the woman, and the sacrifices she had made, and these memories gave them strength. They realized that the difficulties they faced now were small compared to the lessons they had already learned in the house, where love had refused to walk away. Work and study required focus and persistence. They faced bosses and teachers who were impatient and sometimes unfair. They encountered people who doubted their abilities and looked down on them because of their background. But the children had learned to persevere. They had learned that hard work and determination could change outcomes. They had learned that the world could be unfair, but that their values and resilience could carry them through. Despite the distance, the bond with the woman remained strong. She continued to guide them quietly. She offered advice. She provided comfort. She reminded them to stay true to themselves and to never forget the lessons of love, patience, and courage. She had taught them. She reminded them that the world could be harsh, but that they had the power to face it with strength and integrity. the children began to see the fruits of their labor. They achieved small successes in school and work. They found moments of joy and accomplishment. They realized that their dreams were becoming more real with each passing day. They began to understand that the woman's guidance had prepared them to face life's challenges and to find opportunities where others saw obstacles. They began to feel a sense of pride, not just in their achievements, but in the journey that had brought them here. Yet life was not without struggle. Even as they found success, they faced moments of loneliness and doubt. They missed the small house and the quiet evenings with the woman. They missed the safety and certainty of being cared for and guided. They realized that growth often required leaving comfort behind, and that true courage was continuing even when the heart longed for home. The woman herself was growing older. She had spent decades sacrificing her own needs for the sake of the children. She had watched them grow. She had guided them. She had protected them. She had taught them the values that would carry them through life. Now she watched as they stepped into the world on their own. Felt pride and worry at the same time. She knew that life would test them in ways she could not always protect them from, but she also knew that the lessons of love and resilience she had taught them would guide their choices and give them strength. Children began to face adult responsibilities. They had to manage money and time and relationships. They had to navigate challenges that were new and sometimes overwhelming. They relied on the lessons the woman had taught them, on the values of patience, courage, and integrity. They remembered the sacrifices she had made and the love she had shown, and this gave them the determination to keep moving forward even when life was difficult. Friendships and relationships became more complex. They learned that not everyone could be trusted. They learned to recognize those who would support them, those who would take advantage. They applied the lessons of empathy and kindness that the woman had taught them. They learned to balance trust and caution. They began to see that the ability to navigate life successfully required both heart and wisdom, and that the woman's guidance had given them both. The children also began to think about giving back. They realized that the love and care they had received could be shared with others. They wanted to help those who struggled as they had struggled. They wanted to make a difference. They began to see that the lessons of sacrifice and love they had learned could be multiplied and could touch many lives. They began to plan ways to create positive change in the world around them. Through the years, they kept in touch with the woman. They visited her when they could. They shared their achievements and their challenges. They sought her advice and comfort. They understood that she had been their foundation and that her love and guidance had made everything possible. They began to see that the woman's choice to stay with them had shaped their entire lives, and that they carried her lessons into every decision they made. The bond between the woman and the children grew stronger with distance. They realized that love that chooses to stay even when the world walks away is rare and powerful. They understood that their lives were a testament to the strength of consistent care and sacrifice. They began to see that their journey had been shaped not just by chance, but by the quiet decisions of someone who refused to abandon them. Life continued to test them. They faced obstacles in work, in school, and in personal relationships. They experienced moments of doubt and uncertainty. But they had learned to face challenges with patience and courage. They had learned to seek solutions rather than blame. They had learned to rely on the values instilled in them by the woman who had chosen to stay. They carried her lessons like a shield, protecting them from despair and guiding them toward hope. Even as they achieved success, they never forgot their roots. They remembered the small house and the long days and nights of care and sacrifice. They remembered the quiet lessons and the love that had refused to leave. They understood that their accomplishments were built on the foundation of someone else's steadfast commitment. They carried this understanding with humility and gratitude, and began to see that true success is measured not by wealth or fame, but by the ability to love and care for others through it. All the woman remained a constant presence in their lives. She continued to provide guidance. She continued to offer comfort. She continued to remind them of the values that had shaped them. She never demanded anything. She simply showed them that love that chooses to stay is a force that can shape destinies, and that the smallest acts of care can have the largest impact. And so the children moved through life carrying her lessons with them. They faced challenges, they achieved successes, they struggled, they grew, they learned to navigate the world as young adults who had been shaped by the quiet courage of someone who had chosen to stay. They began to understand that the woman's love had given them the strength to face life and the wisdom to create opportunities even when the world seemed indifferent. Began to imagine futures filled with possibilities. They saw ways to use their skills and knowledge to help others. They wanted to make the world a better place. They realized that the sacrifices and love they had received had prepared them to give back and to create change. They began to dream not just for themselves, but for those who had not been as fortunate in these moments of reflection. They understood the power of love that does not walk away. They saw that their entire journey had been shaped by someone who refused to leave them. They began to see that life's greatest miracles often start quietly in small acts of care and courage. They carried this truth in their hearts as they stepped forward into the future, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. Years had passed since the children had left the small house where they had grown up. They had faced challenges and setbacks. They had experienced joy and success. They had learned the world could be harsh and unfair, but also full of possibility. They had carried the lessons of the woman who had stayed with them like a compass, guiding them through life. No matter how far they went or how busy life became, they never forgot the person who had chosen to stay when everyone else walked away. Life had taken them to places they had only dreamed of in the quiet evenings of their childhood. They had worked hard, studied long hours, and faced obstacles that once seemed impossible. They had grown into capable adults who understood responsibility and the power of persistence. They had learned to navigate the world with courage and integrity. They had begun to create lives that reflected the values the woman had instilled in them years before, and in success. They remembered the sacrifices and love that had made everything possible. They recalled the long nights, the early mornings, the small meals and quiet words of encouragement. They remembered the lessons of patience, kindness, and courage. They understood that their achievements were not only their own, but were built on the foundation of someone who had never walked away from them. They felt gratitude and love that could not be measured in words. After many years, they returned to the small house they had left it behind when the world called them to grow. And now they came back with the experiences and strength of a lifetime. They had accomplished things that once seemed impossible. They had created lives that were full and meaningful, but there was a deep desire in their hearts to see the woman who had shaped everything, wanted her to see how far they had come, and to honor the love and sacrifice she had given. The woman was older now. She had lived a life of quiet sacrifice and dedication. She had watched the children grow from a distance. She had worried and hoped. She had faced loneliness and struggle, but she had never wavered in her care. She had always believed in them and had given everything she could to make sure they were safe and loved. Now she saw them standing before her fully grown, and she realized the depth of the miracle she had helped create. The children embraced her. They spoke of their journeys, of the struggles and triumphs they had experienced. They shared the lessons they had learned and the values they carried. They thanked her for the countless small acts of love that had shaped them. They told her that every success, every moment of courage, every act of kindness they had shown came from the foundation she had built. They wanted her to know that her choice to stay had changed their lives forever. The woman listened quietly. She had never sought recognition or praise. She had only wanted to care and protect. She had never imagined that decades later the children would return to show her the impact of her love. She felt joy and humility and a deep sense of fulfillment. She realized that the miracles she had quietly nurtured had grown into something larger than she had ever imagined. The children began to share stories of the world outside, the places they had seen, the people they had met, the challenges they had faced and overcome. They spoke of the lessons they had applied, the values they had carried, and the ways they had tried to help others. They wanted the woman to see that the love and guidance she had given had created ripples far beyond what anyone could measure. They wanted her to understand that her steadfast choice to stay had made them who they had become. As they spoke, the woman reflected on all the years. She remembered the early mornings when she had cooked small meals. She remembered the nights she had stayed awake to comfort them. She remembered the sacrifices she had made and the love she had given freely. She realized that those moments that once seemed ordinary had become the seeds of something extraordinary. She saw that love that refuses to walk away can create miracles. Over time, the children invited her to see the lives they had built. They showed her the places where they worked and studied, the communities they had impacted, and the people they had helped. they shared the ways they were trying to give back to the world and make it a better place. They wanted her to see that her influence had extended beyond the walls of their childhood. Homan had created a legacy of care and courage that would continue for generations. The woman felt a mixture of pride and humility. She realized that the quiet choices she had made decades earlier had grown into something far greater than she had imagined. She understood that the value of her love was not measured in wealth or recognition, but in the lives she had touched and the people she had helped to become strong and compassionate. She felt a sense of peace knowing that the children were thriving and carrying forward the lessons she had taught. The children spent time with her reminiscing about small moments from their childhood, the times they laughed despite hardships, the lessons she had taught them, the warmth of her presence in a world that often seemed cold and unkind. They laughed quietly and remembered the struggles and joys that had shaped them. They realized that even the smallest moments of care and love can leave a lasting impact that carries through a lifetime. Woman shared her reflections as well. She spoke of the challenges she had faced and the moments when she had worried she would not be enough. She talked about the sacrifices she had made and the love that had kept her going. She reminded them that true courage is often quiet, and that love that chooses to stay can create change that lasts far beyond what we can see. She shared wisdom that came from a lifetime of care and resilience. Together, they reflected on the journey they had shared. They saw that life had tested them in many ways, but it also rewarded them for the patience, courage, and love they had cultivated. They realized that the miracles of their lives had begun with a single choice to stay when everyone else walked away. They understood that the woman's unwavering care had created a foundation that allowed them to grow and thrive in ways they had never imagined. The children promised to carry her lessons forward. They vowed to continue acts of kindness and care in the world. They wanted to help others as they had been helped. They wanted to show the same love and commitment that had been shown to them. They understood that their lives were part of a larger story of compassion and courage that could inspire others and create a positive change in ways they had not yet seen. The woman felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She saw that her choice to stay had created more than she could have imagined. She realized that love that does not walk away can create miracles over time. She understood that her life had meaning beyond what she had imagined, and that the small acts of care she had given had shaped the course of the children's lives in ways that could never be measured. In the days that followed, they spent time together, sharing memories and planning for the future. They laughed quietly, they shared meals, they talked about the challenges they had overcome and the dreams they still held. They celebrated the journey of their lives, the love that had guided them. They understood that the past had shaped the present, and that the choices of one person could create a ripple effect that lasts for decades. The children returned to their lives with a renewed sense of purpose. They carried the woman's love and wisdom with them. In every decision they made, they sought to create change and to help others. They understood that the miracles they experienced were born from the quiet, steadfast care of someone who had chosen to stay. They were committed to honoring that legacy in all that they did. Woman watched them go with pride and peace. She realized that her role in their lives had been more important than she had ever imagined. She understood that the simple choice to stay changed the course of many lives. She felt gratitude for the journey and for the love that it carried them all through years of struggle. She knew that the impact of her care would continue long into the future. So the story reached a quiet but powerful conclusion. The children had grown into strong, compassionate adults, guided by the lessons of love, patience, and courage. They had faced the world with resilience and integrity, and had begun to create lives full of meaning and purpose. The woman who had stayed when everyone else walked away had created a miracle that spanned decades. She had shown that love and care can shape lives and create ripples that continue far beyond the moments. The Seath house where they had grown up remained a symbol of the past, of struggles and small victories and all things possible. The memories of sacrifices and care were carried in their hearts and became the foundation for the lives they were building. The story of their journey was a testament to the power of steadfast love and to the miracles that can happen when someone refuses to walk away. The children and the woman had learned that life is full of challenges and that love is a choice. Love is not always easy or convenient, but it is powerful. It has the ability to shape destinies, to inspire courage, and to create hope. Even in the darkest times, they understood that the smallest acts of care can have the largest impact, and that the decision to stay with someone in need can change the course of a life forever. Years later, they would remember this story and carry it with them. They would tell it to others and share the lessons of courage, love, and patience. They would remember that even in a world that sometimes turns away, there is hope, there is power in love, there is strength in choosing to stay, and in that love, miracles can happen.